Hello. This video is going to begin our discussion of Chapter 1 and give us the first half of the discussion of the material presented in Chapter 1, Section 1. This will also function as a introduction to some of the standard things you should be aware of when you're looking at a PowerPoint for our class. We're going to start our Chapter 1 by talking about the basic question of how do we go about understanding our past? How exactly do we do history, or what is history? It may seem obvious to say, but historians are people who study and write about the past. The writing there is an important factor. It's not enough to just think about the past or consider it or reflect on it, but you have to do something where you're going to be sharing that knowledge with others in a reflective way, which they in turn can then look at and reflect on. So the writing about the past, sharing your knowledge with other people, is an important part of what it means to be an actual historian, as opposed to just being somebody who's interested in history. Now, people who are historians generally are going to work with one of two different types of sources. Okay, this is where we get the vast majority of our information, specifically about the ancient world. Okay. The first thing that historians typically work with, okay, are what are called artifacts. Artifact comes from the Latin words ars, which means art or product of art or skill, and facio, which is the verb that means to make. So artefactum literally is something that is made by art, made by skill. And we define artifacts, or our textbook defines artifacts, as objects made by humans. This term, by the way, is in bold and in underlined because it's a term, a vocabulary term for our textbook. So it's an official textbook vocabulary term. So I always put those in bold and underlined. So you should always pay attention to the words that are in bold and underlined. When we say that historians work with artifacts, sometimes we use a similar phrase. We say that they work with material culture, the physical material that is left behind by a group of human beings. Okay. Now, it's important to note an artifact is an object that is made by humans. So there's two items there. It has to be made, it has to be fashioned, and it has to be made by humans, okay, for something to be considered an artifact. A bone isn't necessarily made by humans, right? An animal bone obviously wouldn't be made by a human, okay? A bone that had been carved on, however, would count as an artifact because humans have done something to that bone. They have worked on it in a way that has now turned it into something that is more than its original, form. It's also important to talk about them being made, actually created by humans. And when I say created, I don't mean sort of accidentally, right? So, a human tooth wouldn't necessarily be an artifact. Just a human being made it, right? But they didn't make it in the sense that they sat down one day and decided to use some sort of skill to create or fashion this thing. It just grew out of them. And that's not the same as working on something using art or skill. Okay, so important to understand the qualities of an artifact because certain objects are not going to count as artifacts. Even though they might be closely associated with humans, they're not artifacts. The other thing that historians work with when they're trying to do their work is written evidence. Okay, written evidence is the other big source for historians. Now, different eras and different cultures leave behind different amounts of written evidence and artifacts. Some of the cultures that we talk about in our class will find that they've left behind no written evidence or very, very little written evidence. And then some of them will have lots and lots of written evidence. And then vice versa for artifacts. Some cultures will leave behind many artifacts and some will leave behind very few. So just because we have these two sources doesn't mean that we always have these two sources at any particular, site or whenever we're trying to study a particular civilization. And so it means we have to sort of maximize the amount of results that we get from these, regardless of whether they both show up, one or the other shows up, or whether they don't show up very much at all. Now, the question is, what do historians do with these two things, these artifacts and written evidence? Okay. Mainly, what they do is, first off, evaluate them and continually reevaluate them over time to make sure that they are, in fact, authentic and reliable artifacts or written evidence from this culture or the civilization that you're trying to look into. Okay, it's surprising how many artifacts or how many pieces of written evidence, even today, are still being recognized as fakes or forgeries. Now we have many, many better tools to be able to figure that out. But it was shocking that, some things that scholars have taken as legitimate artifacts or legitimate pieces of writing from antiquity all of a sudden turn into falsehoods in light of new evidence and new techniques. So it's never just to accept the things that have been handed down. You always have to reevaluate. You use that evidence once you've determined whether it's authentic or not, to figure out why did events happen and what was going on in the world that the humans that left behind this evidence, what was going on in their lives. Okay? And you have to do this, you have to do this analyzing and figuring of things out, all while trying to avoid bias and presentism. Okay? Um, Bias is a word you may know. It sort of means a sort of leaning one way or the other in your mind towards something, a sort of unfavorable preference for or disregard for something else. Okay? So, for instance, you could say that a person would be biased towards a particular sports team if they happen to have been from that town where the sports team plays. Okay, um, or you could have a negative bias. You might be from a town that hates another town's team, and so if you have a non-preferential treatment towards another team, that's a form of bias. Okay, so bias is sort of like an unknown or sometimes known leaning that you have one way or the other towards something else. And we need to avoid that as historians. Um, I'll give you another example. My degree, for instance, is in the study of classics of Greece and Rome. And I work very hard when I look back at the ancient world to not always sort of show preferential treatment to the Greeks and the Romans, because that would be a form of bias. That would mean I was biased in my regard for the things that these various eras of history had going on. Presentism, as you see underlined there, is a specific form of bias. It's a type of bias that historians can often display. And it's a form of bias where we accidentally attribute the way things are today back on people from earlier eras. Okay? We assume that the way things are now have to apply the same way to people from the ancient world. And this can be a little bit harder to pull off, to try to avoid presentism, because it's very difficult for us sometimes to remove ourselves from the assumptions that we have about the world around us now, and then look back at the ancient world with a clean slate and none of these preconceived notions. Um, so it's a specific form of bias, presentism, just assuming that people in the ancient world did things the same way that we do them or thought the same way as us, just because that's what we happen to experience today. You'll notice that presentism is not bold on this slide, but it is underlined. And that's because this is a vocab word which I have added into our discussion. It's not an official textbook vocab word, but it's a vocab word that I have added and I'd like you to know. So when you see these slides, if you see things in bold, that typically is a word that is from the textbook and you should know it as a vocab word. And then if you see something that is underlined and not bolded, then that is a word that I also want you to know, but it's not specifically from the textbook. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what some of the processes and what some of the things that historians try to do and try not to do are. Um, there are many different types of people who do history, who study history, but the very first group of historians that we're going to encounter in our discussions are scholars of prehistory. Prehistory is the specific era of human history before the invention of writing. Okay, which kind of makes sense. If history is the study and writing about of events in the human past, then pre-writing would be associated with prehistory. Okay, and the two types of scholars that we're going to talk about at the beginning of our text are anthropologists and archaeologists. Okay, anthropologists are scholars that study the origins and development of people, human beings, and their societies. You may know this from the name. Anthropos in Greek means man, a human being in Greek. So these are scholars of humans. Anthropoi would be the Greek word, okay? And the things that humans do. Okay? And there are many, many, many different types of anthropologists. All of them focus on different things. So, for instance, forensic anthropologists focus on bones and human remains. If you know forensics, not forensics like the type that we do famously at Holy Ghost, which is speech and debate, but forensics like you see in crime shows, right, where they find dead bodies and try to figure out what happened to them. Forensic anthropologists do the same thing, except they are historians that analyze the remains of dead people. Cultural anthropologists specifically study culture, which is the way of life of a society. So they'll focus on the traditions and the customs of a group of human beings, not their physical remains. There are people that specialize in food anthropology, nutritional anthropology. They study the food that humans eat throughout history. And you can come up with any other kinds of anthropologists. Okay, so there's lots and lots of different specific types. One specific type of anthropologist is an archaeologist. Okay, and they are anthropologists which study material remains, artifacts, the objects that humans have left behind. Right. So you probably think about archaeologists as the people that are digging in the dirt and trying to find the artifacts that humans have left behind. They're a type of anthropologist. They focus on the stuff that people leave behind, not the culture of people or their food or their remains. Um, it's often a very difficult job to be an archaeologist because physical remains don't explain themselves. They don't give you a lot of information that it just comes to you. You have to work really hard to piece together some info from just an unspeaking, physical thing. If somebody hands you a tool that you've never used before, never seen used before, it can be very difficult for you to understand, that object. So archaeologists often have to work very, very closely with other scholars to kind of make sense of the remains that they find. And they rely very heavily on technology because, again, finding an object doesn't come with a manual next to it that explains what's going on. So you have to sort of use all the strengths of the technology that we have today to piece out little bits of information from what has been left behind. One of the things that archaeologists and all scholars of history have to rely on is accurately dating things that they find. Okay? And when we do history, we talk about two specific types of dating. How do we date objects? How do we tell where they're from? Okay? And the two types of dating that we talk about are relative dating and absolute dating. Absolute dating is probably the easiest to understand because it's the type of dating where we can figure out exactly how old some object is. So I can tell you exactly if I pick up a rock and I blast it with lasers and do special stuff with it with technology, that it's exactly this many, millions of years old. Or I can take an object created by an ancient person, I can analyze it in different ways, and I can tell you exactly what year it's from. That's what we talk about when we're talking about absolute dating. We're figuring out the exact time that something is from. Our textbook goes over several ways that this is done. Carbon 14 dating is the most famous of all the ways to do absolute dating. It involves measuring the amount of carbon 14 inside of an object and its rate of decay, which happens at a very regular rate. And so if you know how much carbon 14 is in something and how decayed it is, you can get a pretty accurate rendering of exactly how old this object is. Relative dating is a lot less exact. Okay, it's when you can give something a date, but it's sort of an approximate date, or you can tell that it happened within a certain time span, right? You can say, oh, it was somewhere between this era and this era, or you could say it was before the fall of some city, right? But you can't give an exact date. You can only date it by relating it to some other thing, whether that's another event or a range of dates. Um, so one of the most famous ways that this is done is through stratification, figuring out where in the various strata of the Earth's layers is this object found in. And if you know exactly where that is in the ground, you can roughly determine its age. Um, so relative dating and absolute dating are two types of ways that we can figure out the dates for objects. Obviously, we'd love it if we could absolutely date anything, because that's what we're looking for in history is exact numbers. But in the absence of that, we can always rely on relative dating to give us a general sense of from what time this object may have come. It might not be super exact, but it's better than not having any date associated with the object at all. Okay, so that'll be it for our introductory talk about history. After this, we're going to start talking about prehistoric human beings. Where did they come from, and who are some of the most famous scholars to find these early humans?